This is Beyond the Big Screen podcast with your host, Steve Guerra.
I'd like to welcome a very special guest today, Lucy Jane Santos. Lucy Jane Santos is an independent historian and expert on the history of 20th century health and beauty. Today, we are going to talk about Lucy Jane's fascinating book, Half-Lives, The Unlikely History of Radium. And I'd like to say it right now, I love the history of science and how science develops and how it gets incorporated into the popular culture. And so this has like everything that I really love in a book. And I'm really glad that I was able to find out about it. But before we go too far, how did you become interested in the history of science and health and beauty in particular?
Well, there's two different things for that. I was interested in the history of health and beauty, but I was sort of started looking at from a point of view. So about a decade ago, I was known as the glamourologist, a name I gave myself, to be clear. And I would go around talking about how to get the vintage look. And I worked with two other women, and we would do tutorials where I teach people to have the red lipstick and the flicky eyeliner and things like that. So I was very much into history of beauty, but it was very much in that vein. And then again, about a decade ago, I started working for the British Society for the History of Science. And the very ridiculous reason I got into the history of science is because at the interview, I realized I didn't really understand what the history of science was. My cat's just walked in, I'm afraid.
That's been known to happen.
He's been asleep all day. I realized in the job interview that I didn't really understand what the history of science was. So I frantically started researching it and sort of realized that this is what I was doing anyway. I was looking at the history of beauty, but from a health and well-being perspective as well. I was looking at all of these sort of weird and wonderful things that we do to ourselves in the name of beauty, and the quite questionable ingredients that are in cosmetics then and now. And that's sort of how I got into and how I started understanding that I was already working in the history of science. I just hadn't twigged. In terms of radioactivity and in terms of radium, because I was into history of makeup, I used to go out and buy big boxes of cosmetics from auction houses. And one day, one of the boxes, which I'll show you. So this is a beautiful looking black powder, face powder box. It's beautiful black with Art Deco-y looking lettering on it and silver on the side. And I was really excited. And then I flipped it over, and the ingredients on the back of it says made from radium bromide. And I was like, oh. So then I started investigating, and again, that history of cosmetics, the history of beauty, and the history of science all sort of wrapped up into one wonderful find that I'd never heard of. I'd never heard that anyone was using radium in beauty products. I knew people using arsenic and lead and mercury, but radium is a whole different ballgame.
I guess before we get too far, maybe we can all get everybody and all of us on the same page about maybe the basic science of it. What is radiation and where does it come from in order to get put into these different products?
And it's really hard to answer this question. I always laugh when I give talks about it because I try and sum up decades of serious scientific work in like 3 seconds. And it almost sounds quite dismissive, but radioactivity was discovered through X-rays. So I really always start thinking about X-rays. X-rays were discovered in the late 1890s by a German scientist, Wilhelm Röntgen. He got these invisible rays, these rays that were invisible to the human eye, and other scientists were looking to see whether these rays could come from elsewhere. So Röntgen's X-rays, which he called them, were generated. He used equipment to make them, but other scientists were looking to see whether these invisible rays were actually present in nature. So you go through Henri Becquerel, who discovers the phenomenon of radioactivity. And then you have Marie and Pierre Curie, who discovered radioactive elements, polonium and radium. So nobody really knows what they're doing for a few years, but it's found out that these elements are not stable, they are disintegrating, and this process becomes known as atomic disintegration. So they're changing into something else. And at the same time they're doing that, they're emitting alpha rays, beta rays, and gamma rays. So radioactive elements are non-stable elements that were discovered in the 1890s, and radium really becomes the most famous of them all. They worked out that uranium, for instance, which was an element that had been known for a long time, was radioactive. Polonium, again, discovered by the Curies, but never really reached the same level of excitement that radium did for the general public.
Now, some of these elements like polonium and uranium and radium, where were they getting them from initially?
So when I said at the beginning that scientists were looking to see whether rays were coming from nature, Marie Curie is basically testing every single mineral and ore that she could find to really decide whether any other element, whether anything was producing these rays. And she took an order from, she had some pitchblende, which is a black mineral that came from a town in Austria, came from a town in the Czech Republic, what is now the Czech Republic, called St. Joxtamo, which was called at the time, is now known as Yakimov. And she had some pitchblende, and she was doing all the sort of scientific analysis around it. You know, she was breaking it down basically. So you boil it, you evaporate it, you do this, you do that to try and put it down to its smallest element. And she found that she was measuring the rays that were coming out of the pitchblende, and she knew that it contained uranium, but it was giving out more radioactivity than could be accounted for from just the uranium content alone. So they carried on, you know, grinding down and evaporating and doing the chemical analysis until they found these two new other elements. And again, that is trying to be very simplified for it because it's a massive job.
Now these these different rays that they put out, like alpha, beta, gamma rays, those, some of them are kind of dangerous, depending, and going to like on a spectrum of more dangerous. How do they exactly interact with the body, so to speak, and what could be the danger element from those different rays that come off of them, or radiation, if you will?
Well, the first thing is, because each of them have different properties, they don't interact with the body in the same way. And it's really the sort of the alpha rays and the gamma rays that you sort of, people are fearful of. And this is where my actual grasp of the science behind it will probably fail me. Because when I'm actually, when I'm talking about the products that I'm looking at, it's not specifically about the rays that we're looking at. We're talking about the salts and the different techniques that we used in medicine here. So what I do is start with the science and then head into the medicine side of things. So we're looking at Curie therapy, which was known as radium therapy, or mild radium therapy as well. And again, it's obviously the rays are all bound up in that, but the difference is the way that they use the actual radium salts and the atomic disintegration process as well.
It's kind of interesting too, and I didn't really realize this until I read the book, is that a lot of these things like radium, uranium, they're not only radioactive, but they're also toxic as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, uranium is a really good example of that. The toxicity of uranium had been used for a long time before they realized, well, before radioactivity had even been thought of as a concept, really. So uranium had a history of being used as a toxic element, and it was used in things like diabetes treatments in the 1840s, I think. And you were really using the toxicity of the heavy metal aspect of it to sort of trigger a reaction within the body, which was said to, in the case of diabetes, it was said that the toxicity of the uranium would trigger something that was said to cure. I mean, I don't think anyone ever actually cured anyone of diabetes.
Maybe quite
through
the opposite.
yeah, but it was still being, even after the radioactivity of uranium had been determined, you still get uranium being used as a toxic treatment for things like diabetes well into the 20th century, and by big name medical companies as well. But yes, so yeah, it's not just the radioactivity. They're also playing on the associations of the toxicity that have been known for a long time before radioactivity was even thought of.
It's really interesting that Marie Curie and others they're discovering this in the 1890s-ish. And almost immediately, people start applying this to actual medical treatments. And some of these medical treatments are completely legitimate and things that we use to today. And some of them are not very legitimate. What was maybe the development of some of the more legitimate forms of usage of radiation in the medical industry?
Well, you can really, I mean, it's not as if X-rays and radioactivity pop up out of the blue and suddenly get used in medical treatments. They're already continuing on a path. So again, simplifying, electricity has been used as medical treatments for quite a while. And a lot of these people who started experimenting with X-rays and radioactivity in turn were already from that tradition of electrical therapy. So there's already a history of that. And again, it's also generated electrical therapy as well. So you've got that mechanical aspect. So you start almost as soon as X-rays are discovered, people start using them diagnostically in the first place, because, you know, the magic of being able to see inside the human body, to see a broken bone or a bullet or anything that could be lodged in there, was a massive, massive boon for the medical industry. So you start getting that. And then those experimenters start discovering that if they play around with X-rays too long, their skin reddens, it blisters, and sometimes it even comes off. And a lot of these medical people are also of the opinion that it's hormosis. So a little bit of what's bad for you is good for you, like cures like. And they said, well, if X-rays can do this to unhealthy skin, to healthy skin, what can it do to unhealthy skin? So they start training these invisible generated X-rays at people's bodies for skin disorders, for surface tumors and things like that. And they did start reporting, there did seem to be some successes. You know, X-rays do burn the skin. And if you have like a birthmark or something like that, and you are exposed to X-rays, it is going to burn off the skin and it will cure you of your birthmark. And the same with surface tumors as well. It is going to obliterate them. So it was soon found out that radium salts, so when the Curies isolate their radium, it's in the form of a salt, which they only have small, tiny amounts of, and the scientists are carrying it around in little vials and sharing it amongst each other, because it takes years to isolate radium. And it's a time-consuming and very difficult process. So these salts are rare and expensive. So they're carrying them around from Paris to London and taking them around their different labs. And they reported that if you kept a vial of radium salts in your pocket, it would burn through the skin, or burn through your clothes to the skin. So people were saying, well, X-rays work, radium salts do the same thing. Let's start using that. So you're getting really, really serious scientists, and it's a weird thing to say serious scientists and non-serious science, but you've got the Curies. Pierre Curie is one of the first people that, I think this is about 1901, he starts talking to people who are working in hospitals and saying, and they're experimenting together with these salts. These salts have benefits over X-rays because you don't need a generator to make them. And these salts are going to do a similar thing. They are going to be helping surface tumors. Even better, you can insert the salts into the human body, cut a little hole and put the tube of radium salts in there and get the deep-seated tumors as well. So this is massive massive benefits, so that your stakes are really high at this point.
And now, a brief word from our sponsors. Yeah, it seems like that there was a real blending. It wasn't a clear dichotomy between really science and pure health and then the patent medicine snake oil. There was kind of a blending. And I think, would you say because all of these things were so new, they were trying a lot of different things, and some things that might seem like total, almost like quack science to us today were really a part of the process of learning what this material was useful for.
Yeah, and I mean, although I think we all can picture what a quack medicine salesman, comes into town on a wagon and sells absolute nonsense is, sometimes I would argue that the stuff that we think of quacks of course it wasn't quackery at the time. I mean, I talk fairly extensively about a Dr. William Morton in the book, and he is actually a very serious scientist, and he has written that he's an X-ray pioneer. He's incredibly well connected. He wrote the first book actually about X-rays therapies in the US, and he is a professor of a New York university. He's pretty mainstream, I would argue. But in 1904, he said that he'd cured cancer using a treatment that was a mixture of radium, water, and light. And his idea was that you would drink a mixture of water and quinine glows when it's exposed to UV lights. And he also said quinine would glow when it was exposed to radioactivity. So if you drank this water and quinine and then were exposed to radioactivity, he argued that your insides would glow and would be bathed in light. And that could cure you because it was getting rid of the bacteria in your body through the healing powers of light. Now that sounds absolute nonsense, but at the time it was taken incredibly seriously by a lot of people. It was soon, the following year, it was proven that it wasn't right, and he hadn't cured these people's cancers through this treatment. But, at the time in 1904, he was, this was representing one of the biggest hopes for the cure for cancer that the world had known, at the time. So it's kind of sad. You sort of see these people, and some of them are quite serious and quite mainstream, and they try these things, and then they get proven wrong, and it sort of perhaps goes a bit downhill from there. But you've also got people like the scientist William Ramsay in England, and he's Nobel Prize winning serious science discoverer of everything. But by 1912, he's so into radium, he has joined forces with a company called the Radium Development Syndicate, and they've got this idea to turn a spa town in England, Bath, spa town in England, into the radium spa town. And again, it's interesting to see these scientists going from sort of pure science to actually consumerizing it and going down a business route, because their proposal was to invest £25 million in a town to make it Britain's radium spa town. I mean, again, that sounds like a nonsense to us, but the amount of money that they were talking about, people were taking this very seriously.
Yeah, that's the spa towns and the springs is such an interesting topic, because I think I never even realized how many things that are common to us are radioactive. It's just a part of the nature, like a lot of the salt that we have in these springs. Like in the United States, there's Saratoga Springs, Hot Springs, Arkansas, Warm Springs in England, there's Bath and some of these other towns, but there's tons of other ones as well. And a lot of those springs, aren't they naturally radioactive?
Yeah, so simplifying again, the atomic disintegration process essentially means that wherever you find uranium deposits in the world, if there's water, the water's trickling over the rocks and will eventually become radioactive of some kind. So yeah, a lot of these mineral spa towns. So it's not sort of fresh water. It's not that type of thing. It's these mineral ones. The water comes deep from within or runs down the side of a mountain. Yeah, wherever you find those, chances are they were either radioactive now or at some point had been venerated for being radioactive.
This kind of leads into one of the probably one of the most surprising ones, I think, of all the anecdotes that you had included in the book, was about Aben Byers. He was a famous athlete in the early 20th century, and he started drinking a water concoction that had a heavy dose of radiation. Could you tell us a little bit more about that particular product and a little bit about Byers, because this was like mind-blowing?
Well, yes. So the product itself is called Radithor, and it was introduced in 1925 by by William J. Bailey, and it was Bailey's Laboratories Inc., something like that. And it's basically some radium salts in water. And it's a tiny little bottle. I've never seen one in real life, but I think it's sort of half an inch, something like that. And it was basically sold as being something that would cure 150 diseases. So everything pretty much. And the recommended dose was 1 bottle a day, and you could bathe in it or drink it after meals. And, so it was just a shot of water, like one of those little probiotic yogurt drinks that you have now that you can just drink down in the morning. And like I said, it was sold as everything. It was known as a liquid sunshine. So I talked earlier about William Morton, the idea that you'd be bathed in sunshine if you drank water that had been activated by radioactivity, and it's a very similar thing. And it also plays on associations of spa towns, because spa towns were saying their waters were liquid sunshine, bathing you in this beautiful, soft, gentle radioactivity that's going to cure everything. Now, Eben Byers, he had been an amateur golfer, millionaire playboy, but by when did he start taking it? So I think he started taking Radithor about 1927, and his glory days were, a few decades before that. But he's a millionaire playboy, and he. In 1927, he hurts his shoulder, and he's away from home, and he sees a doctor, and the doctor prescribes him with Radithor. Radithor really does skirt the boundaries of quack and mainstream and just terrible, because Radithor, which was actually normal practice as well, but Radithor gave kickbacks to the doctors who gave it out to their clients, because the owners were making a lot of money. There was a 400% profit margin on these products. So Bailey, the owner, is making tons of money off this. So he's throwing out kickbacks to doctors, pharmacists, anyone that can get his products into the hands of customers. So Eben Byers starts taking these products. Now, the recommended amount is 1 bottle a day. Eben Byers apparently is taking 3 bottles a day.
One's good. Why not 3? Right?
Yeah, I haven't. There's only sort of contemporary newspapers to really read about him, but everything I've read about him suggests that he does things to extreme anyway. But there is also a rumor that he's a millionaire playboy in the final years of being a playboy, and one of the things that Radithor is meant to do is sort of pep you up. So there's this idea that not only does his shoulder hurt, but he's trying to get his youth back as well. And so he's drinking 3 bottles a day anyway. And after a few years, he starts complaining of toothache and headaches. He's losing loads of weight, and he goes to see another doctor. And they recognize the symptoms of radiation poisoning in him. And by 1932, because he's quite well known at the time, there's a lot of interest. So when his diagnosis comes through, the newspapers pick up on it, and he gets a profile it's not a profile of him, but there's an article in Time magazine about him and Radithor, because it becomes a bit of a court case as well, because, something that's freely available like this being prescribed and taken by a lot of New York society as well, is quite a scary thing, and people are very interested in it. And in this Time magazine article, it describes how they've found him. So the special investigator goes to his home, and they describe him as basically his face has caved in. The radium has attacked his jaws. It's sort of disintegrated the bones, and he's lost half of his jaw, all of his teeth. He has holes forming in his brain, in his skull. And then he dies the following year. So this is really serious, scary stuff, and it's a horrible death as well, and it's really high profile. And so he dies in 1933. He'd also given bottles of Radithor to his friends. One of his friends, Mary Hill, had been taking it. She'd been an athlete, and she died in 1931. So really you start getting these people all connected with each other, but they've died, and it's in a really graphic, brutal way.
You said in the book that they exhumed him in 1965, 30 years later, and his body and his crypt was still highly radioactive.
There was a whole, at the time, I mean, when all of this is happening, so sort of in the 1900s to the late 1930s, let's say, people knew that radiation was dangerous, but there was very little studies, especially outside of the science world, on the dangers of exposure to radioactivity in this manner. In the 60s, people start going back and looking at the bodies of people who had who had died. So there is Ibn Bayez. They also looked at the bodies of the radium girls, which is probably a better known story of the damage that uncontrolled exposure to radioactivity can do to the human body. So they started just basically digging up people to see what was happening. And yes, if you have 3 bottles a day of radium water over the period of several years, it's still kicking about in you. It's there for a long time.
The Radium Girls is another really interesting story, and Evan Byers is so extreme, but the Radium Girls, they were really getting into something that they had no idea, that they were being exposed to such a level of radiation just through work.
Yeah, it's a really sad story. And I mean, so the Radium Girls were women who worked in factories, and their job was to put radium paint, which glowed in the dark, onto watch dials and the faces of watches, so you could see your watch in the dark. And it was a really fashionable and very useful piece of kit. I mean, in the First World War, glow-in-the-dark watches were really very heavily marketed as being beneficial for people in the trenches, for instance, or in the early aircraft, because there's no electrical systems, so you can't see your instruments at night. So you put a little bit of glow-in-the-dark radium paint on it, and suddenly you can do night missions, or you can carry out your trench warfare without showing your position to the enemy. And then in the 1920s, radium glow-in-the-dark watches are fashionable. So it's really not, you can see the time in the theatre, at work. You don't have to turn the light on when you get up in the morning. They're very beneficial. So the Radium Girls are painting these watches, and because there's such demand for them, they're coming up with all these different tricks to try and work even quicker, because they're mostly getting paid by the watch. So you want to, churn them out, don't you? And the girls came up with this technique, and they were encouraged to come up with this technique of pointing their brushes. So you put in between painting each dial, you put your paintbrush into your mouth, point it, so you get a fine tip, so you're less likely to make any smudges, you'll work quicker. But of course, every time they're putting it into their mouth, they're also licking off the radium paint that's on it, and then dipping and then licking and dipping and licking. There's also stories of them painting themselves with the paint as well, the leftovers at the end of the day, because it's fun, because it glows in the dark. So people are putting it on their nails, apparently. I've seen people suggesting that sometimes they were wearing it as lipstick. You can imagine it would be quite fun, actually.
Yeah.
And because nobody in the higher management has said anything about this might be dangerous, even though they did know at the time that it was, and because radium is being sold in shops and in beauty salons and all of these other places being beneficial, these women very normally thought, well, this isn't going to hurt me. In fact, maybe if I spend all day licking my paintbrush and then put it on my nails at night and put it through my hair, I'm actually going to, live forever because it's healthy. Yeah, and then obviously it wasn't. And I think it was by 1924, I think, 26, sorry, it's gone from my head at the moment, women had started dying. I mean, I think there was about 9 women in one factory alone who died by the mid-1920s, and they died from radiation poisoning. The worst thing is that nobody knew that they died from radiation poisoning. I mean, probably the owners of the factories had a fair idea, but they started saying it was syphilis or anything they could to try and get out of the responsibility of looking after their factory workers, and then taking responsibility when their product had started harming them as well.
That kind of is interesting because it leads into the beauty aspect. And you showed us and described that box of face powder. What was the supposed benefit of putting radium and radioactive materials into beauty products?
The benefits were the same benefits as the idea of going to a spa town. So it's a process called mild radium therapy. And the idea is that a tiny bit of radium this isn't burning your skin, this isn't anything scary like this, but a tiny bit of radium is going to trigger your metabolism. So basically it's going to speed everything up. So it'll speed up cell renewal, hair growth. I mean, they then go a little bit further and say that it will actually turn your grey hair back to your natural hair color. It's basically reversing time. But this small amount of radioactivity is doing wondrous things to your metabolism. That's basically it, is activating you at a cellular level. And so a lot of these products. So I have hair restorers, for instance, empty bottles of hair restorers, and they're all sold on the basis that you put it on your hair, it's going to stimulate the follicle, beautiful head of hair is going to come. It will turn, as I said, grey hair into your natural colour. It will make your hair longer, stronger, and all of those things. In terms of face products, it's renewing your cells. So it's going to make you glow, but it's not glowing as in radioactive glowing, but it's a natural glow. It's going to bring a little bit of colour to the surface of your skin. It's going to reinvigorate your cells, get rid of wrinkles, crow's feet, all of those things. And then the lipsticks and there's mascaras as well. So mascaras are going to they're going to make your eyelashes fuller, more luxurious. Lipsticks are going to get rid of the wrinkles around your lips. I mean, these are all promises that cosmetics still say today. It just has a slightly different layer of meaning when one of the main ingredients is radioactivity.
And now, a brief word from our sponsors. How much radioactive material were they putting in these? Because even at that early time, they were still fairly expensive. I'm sure there was a lot of variation in where you got them, but for the average product, were they fairly radioactive?
It's actually very hard to know. There's some that were tested at the time, and they usually suggest that, so they're tested by governments, they're tested by medical regulators, and their problems usually are that there's not enough radioactivity in them, but they suggest it's very low levels. In terms of what's left for us to test today, very, very little has been tested. I have, as I said, a couple of powders that claim to be made with radium, and pre-pandemic I got them tested, but we haven't been able to do the analysis of that yet. But a lot of these products are probably made from, rather than radium salts, which are really expensive, they're made from the disintegration product radon, which is a gas. And radon has a half-life of like 3 days, so it's gone. There's no way of knowing now what was in them. One of the hair tonics I have is Frederick Godfrey's Renair Antiseptic Radioactive Hair Tonic. And what we do know about him is that his factory was on the banks of the river, banks of the stream that brought the radioactive water into a spa town in England. So we know that they've tested those waters, and it was said that he was basically just scooping up the water and using that in his product. So we can say, well, yeah, probably it has a little bit of radioactivity in it. But again, the tests that they were doing at the time aren't necessarily very accurate. And a lot of testing that has been done on especially radioactive waters these days has shown that they vastly overestimated the amount of radioactivity in the spa waters of these mineral spa towns. So yeah, it's really difficult to get a handle of it. I think most of the products would have had some sort of radioactivity in it, but again, you can make creams and liquids radioactive just through the gas, just by standing the cream in the same room as a piece of radium salts. You can turn it radioactive. It's going to last 10 seconds. It's not really going to do anything, but that is enough to have it understood to be a radioactive product.
It seemed to me like there was 3 phases of popularity, or where the radioactivity and that whole idea kind of were really big in the popular imagination. And that initial phase of what we're talking a lot about, where people were taking these drinks and doing a lot with the cosmetics. And did that kind of phase out in the 30s? And then radioactivity started to get popular again after the atom bomb in World War II, and it kind of got rejuvenated the popularity of radioactivity.
Yeah, I think there was definitely ebbs and flows in the popularity of these things. And one of the things I tried to do in the book was to make it chronological, because I was really trying to get a sense of the fashion and the sense of how things did become popular, but then slightly not again, and then back and forth. And one of the things is that I assumed walking into this project that after the Radium Girls, after Ibn Bayez had died, and then Marie Curie herself died in 1934, I'd kind of thought that was it. Of course, nobody would like these products because these are really famous cases. These are front page news. So why would anyone voluntarily walk into a shop a couple of months after Ibn Bayez died, Marie Curie died, all this publicity around the Radium Girls, and buy a radium lipstick, for instance? I mean, it made no sense. And I found loads of products. I found that, in fact, that after Ibn Bayez had died, and I've got no way of telling whether it was because of it, but you start getting loads more products. I mean, one thing is that new sources of radium have been discovered, but you start getting things like the New Ray electrical lamp, which is a combination of radioactive materials and a lamp, and it's said to it prevents eye strain. So you go home at night, turn on your radioactive lamp, and do your sewing or whatever close work you need to do. You've got a corset, a radiumized corset in 1937 that said to slenderize you and rejuvenate you. So again, these are in 1937 is a decade after the Radium Girls. So you can't say that people don't have this understanding that radioactivity possibly is quite bad for you. But you've got this explosion of products, and the product I showed at the beginning, I talked about at the beginning of this session, was released in 1933. Again, and this company carried on selling their products for 30 years afterwards. So yeah, radium never goes quite the way you expect it. So you've got this massive interest, and then you're right, it does start losing it a bit after the late 30s. But then it changes again after the atomic bomb. So straight after the atomic bomb, you've got this interest in atoms rather than radium, rather than uranium. And you even see it in the beauty industry. So I think about 3-4 months after atomic bombs in New Zealand, a brand of lipstick launches that's called Atomic Fire or something like that. And they sell it flame swept, will destroy everything in its path, that type of stuff. And and there's atom bomb perfume, and there's things like that. And it's this is where I have to say, for my next book, I'm writing about specifically after the atom bombs. I'm looking at the journey of uranium, which then will encompass the atomic bomb. It will encompass things that I couldn't pick up in the radium story. But yeah, there's a real change in perception. And then, of course, in the 1950s, you start getting the uranium boom in the US, and so much interest in, well, not necessarily interest, but experience in atomic bomb testing and things like that. And then you do then start getting another whack of interest in these products, but they're not natural radium at this point. A lot of it is depleted uranium or radioactive materials that are formed as part of of nuclear experimentation. So again, it is radium-ish, but it's slightly different again, and it's a completely different story.
Yeah, we'll definitely have to talk about that story for sure, but at some point. And then we get into kind of the last phase, and it seems that now we're in a phase where we're almost at the exact opposite, where anything that's radioactive, people are fearful of, and it seems like we've hit an opposite end of the spectrum now. Do you think that that's probably an accurate thing?
Yeah, I think my working theory has always been that we've got so mixed up in between natural radioactivity, from what I can't think of a better way of saying it, man-made radioactivity, uncontrolled use of radioactivity, controlled use of radioactivity. It's all sort of got a bit mixed up. And as soon as you bring an atomic bomb into a conversation, it just changed. It just changed it had to change everyone's perspective, and it did. And there's so much fear surrounding nuclear weapons that it's really difficult to talk about the other side of nuclear destruction. It's really difficult to talk about radium. And one of the best ways I think about this is that when I talked earlier about how Marie Curie got pitchblende, a black mineral, and she got it from a town in the Czech Republic. That town in 1909 started selling itself, because it was the home of radium, so the home of radioactivity. It started selling itself as a spa town. And one of the things that I find the most interesting is that when I tell people that in 2017 or 2018 now, I went to that spa town and they still have radioactive water treatments, and I went and had a radium bath. And it's very normal there. And, it's a town, there's about 12 hotels, and people specifically go there to bathe and drink in the radioactive water. And for so many people, that is just a horror story, isn't it? I mean, it's just so scary that they could even contemplate doing that. But it's not. It's normal. It's a lot of people find it very, very beneficial. There are studies that suggest it could be beneficial. I mean, it's very, very. I'm trying to be very careful here, because it's a very emotive subject and very controversial as well. The idea that a small amount of radioactivity could be beneficial is not an idea that, when you say it, most people will greet with any enthusiasm. But yeah, you can go to the town, and it was full when I went there. Deep winter, tons of people, all having their treatments.
Oh, that's so interesting. After World War II, there's a lot of popular media that had atomic in it. Was that so much? Were there films or songs or that sort of thing that included radium and radiation, and say the 20s and the 30s, sort of that golden age of music and film?
Right at the beginning, so around about 1900s, there's tons of songs about radium and radioactivity, and poems and plays and all sorts of things. As it gets later, they really start taking a dark turn. So we're talking about the 1930s earlier. So this is a bit before the Second World War, obviously. But in the 1930s, you actually got two films that talk about radioactivity, talk about specifically about radium. So there's a film called Blonde Venus with Marlene Dietrich and Cary Grant in 1932. Her husband is dying from radiation poisoning. He's a commercial chemist. So she has to pay for his treatment. So she's forced back into the world of the cabaret, which she'd left when she got married, and into the arms of Playboy Cary Grant. And I always think that's just a terrible thing to have to happen to you, isn't it? If you've got to end up with Cary Grant, that's just awful. But that whole film is about radiation poisoning. And I think I must have seen it about 1 million times and hadn't even realized. There's another film, Nothing Sacred, in 1937 with Carole Lombard. She's a radium dial painter in a factory. She's diagnosed with radiation poisoning, told she's dying. So she gets sent to New York, at all expenses trip to New York by the, New York Post or something. And it's framed as young girl can see the world before she dies. This is the Radium Girls. And this is a comedy that they've made in 1937 about, it's not necessarily a spoiler to say that she's not actually dying of radiation poisoning. But it's, I think it's I find it absolutely bizarre that these two Hollywood films, radium poisoning, completely different plot lines about it. But after the Second World War, after the atomic bomb, obviously it takes a different tone. It's not that radioactivity is going to damage a human, it's that it does something else to a human body. So it's, this is where we start getting mutants and mad scientists ready to control the world and things like that. Obviously there is a little element of that beforehand, because there's always that edge with radium. There was always one of the things that was one of the first properties of radium that was discovered was not only that it glowed in the dark, but that it emitted an energy, heat, and it was sort of spontaneous, and it was always slightly warmer than its environment. And even at the beginning, this was suggested that it would power steamships. It could do this, it could do that. So there was always that sort of edge towards it. And then it sort of also gets mixed up with ideas of invisible rays and ray guns as well. I think the original Batman series is about, it's been a long time since I've seen it, but they come up with a ray gun type thing that's made from radium or something like that. It's all of this type of thing. So radium is very infused into Hollywood. It's infused into the film and theatre as well. One of the treats I'm saving up to really, really get into is this post-Second World War ideas of atomic and radioactivity, and looking at all the films that wasn't quite this area that I was studying for this book. So I've started building up a little collection and a little wish list of things to watch.
Out of all of these different products that you've researched and seen, is there one that you find the most fascinating that really struck you as particularly interesting? For me, it was the Radithor, is that just such a tiny little bottle, and you drink one of them a day and you're probably going to die from it. But was there one that really caught your imagination?
Because one of my main interests outside of cosmetics is cocktails, the thing that really captured my imagination was the idea of a radioactive cocktail. And in the 1920s, a company called Sparklets came up with, they'd already been around for quite a long time, since about the 1890s, Sparklet soda siphons. It's a way of turning normal water into carbonated water. You put a little carbonated bulb in it, and you press down the lever, and it turns the water into, it's a soda stream, but less technical. But in the 1920s, they came up with the idea that if you could turn tap water into carbonated water, why not turn it into radioactive water at the same time? So they made a range of these bulbs, which were radon bulbs. So they've got a little bit of radioactivity in them. And when you put it in the siphon, activate it by pressing down the lever, it shoots out radioactivity into the water as well. And the thing that really got me into you're thinking about this product is, I found an article in the New York Times that said that these could be made to make radioactive cocktails, and that you could go into the top bars and supper clubs in the 20s and order a whiskey and radioactivity, things like that. And as far as I know, it never happened. I don't think they were really sold as home products. They were made, they were on sale for about 20 odd years, but they were sort of water for home. And I don't think, I've spoken to a few archivists of hotels in London, because it was a UK product, and they've never heard of it. It doesn't mean it didn't happen, but the idea that you could walk into a bar and have a radioactive cocktail, that's just, for me, is a combination of all my great loves in life.
Is there a place where people can follow you and kind of keep up with some of your projects and interests?
Well, I set up something called the Museum of Radium, and it's just Museum of Radium as the domain name, and there's a Twitter account associated with that, and that's going to be where I put all of the radium stuff, because there is so much. I have a personal website and a personal Twitter and Instagram, which is all Lucy Jane Santos.
I want to thank you so much for your time. It was a really fascinating look at a really interesting part of history.
Thank you. I really enjoyed talking about it, as you might be able to tell.
Thank you again for listening to Beyond the Big Screen podcast. Of course, a huge thanks goes out to Lucy Jane Santos, author of the book Half-Lives, The Unlikely History of Radium. Links to learn more about Lucy Jane and her book can be found at museumofradium.co.uk or in the show notes. A great way to support Beyond the Big Screen is to leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts. These ratings and reviews really help me know what you think about the show and help other people learn about Beyond the Big Screen. If you are into social media, if that's your thing, you can connect with me and other people who want to learn more about the movies they watch on Facebook and Twitter by searching for A2Z History. You can contact me there or just send me a good old-fashioned email to my email address, steve@a2zhistorypage.com. Links to all of this and more can be found at a2zhistorypage.com. I will see you next time beyond the big screen.